I saved my father's company, making it a $150 million empire, while my Playboy brother was still favored. He humiliated me and took the CEO role, firing me. This story is titled, My Deadbeat Brother. He spent years partying while I turned Dad's failing company into a $150 million empire. He fired and humiliated me during the shareholders' meeting. I left quietly. Hello everyone. Before we begin, a small favor. If you love this type of work, please subscribe. It's free, helps the channel, and ensures you never miss out on great videos. Okay, let's get started. Hey Reddit, have you ever had one of those moments when you feel like everything in your life is hanging by a thread? That was where I was 10 years ago, staring at a mess I hadn't made but couldn't ignore. Let me backtrack a little. My father created this corporation from nothing. He was good at what he did, but what about money? Not very much. By the time I was 26, just out of business school, the company was losing money. My father, 10 years older than he was, buried in tension. And what about my older brother, Brian? He was not helping. Brian was 31 at the time. While I was working hard to understand supply networks and financial models, he was, let's just say, having a good time. He possessed an effortless charm that made him the favorite. Always have, always will. I knew that. It wasn't new, but it still stings. One night, I found my father sitting in his office, surrounded by mountains of unpaid invoices and contracts that were never going to be fulfilled. He didn't even notice me walking in. His desk looked like a catastrophe zone, and he didn't appear to have slept for weeks. When he finally recognized me, he remarked, "I believe it is over, son. I'm not sure how to fix this." That hit me more than I expected. I'm not sure if it was the weight of his words or the reality that everything he had worked for could crumble, but something inside me clicked. I promised him, I will handle it. I'm not sure whether he believed me at the time, but he didn't argue. Honestly, I believe he was relieved that someone was stepping up. Since then, I have almost lived at the office. I understood every detail about how the corporation operated, or, more precisely, how it did not function. I became acquainted with the numbers, renegotiated contracts, and spoke with every client that passed through the door. Many of them did not want to hear from me. I was young and inexperienced, and they had already lost faith in us. I cannot tell you how many times I was told no or had doors shut in my face, but I kept showing up. People noticed that, even those who didn't like me initially began to take me seriously after a time. The first year was grueling. I was working at least 16 hours a day. My father was still officially in charge, but he delegated the majority of the decision-making authority. I drastically reduced unneeded spending. This includes some of Brian's more extravagant expenses. He had this habit of charging personal expenses to the company account, and no one ever stopped him. I halted it. He did not take it well. I recall him showing up at the office one day just to laugh at me. "Look at you, playing CEO," he said. "Don't become too comfy. Dad will not let you take it." I ignored him as always. I knew how the game worked. Brian was the favorite. He was always given credit for things he didn't do, as well as the benefit of the doubt when he made mistakes. But I was not doing this for approval. I was doing it because I didn't want to waste my father's hard work. By the end of the year, things began to improve. We weren't prospering yet, but we also weren't drowning. Slowly, we began to rebuild our reputation. Clients returned, staff came to believe that their jobs were safe, and the company was genuinely profitable. It wasn't much, but it was something. However, success does not solve all problems. My father was proud of our development, but in his opinion, Brian could do no wrong. Brian was always proud of me, no matter what I accomplished. Even though Brian was rarely around, my father would discuss his economic acumen over family dinners, while everyone else was talking about vacations. I was calculating numbers and strategizing for expansion. It was not fair, but life rarely is. I decided early on that I didn't need the credit. If Brian chose to accept all of the acclaim, that was acceptable. I had larger aims in mind. My father's praise would have been good. But what mattered to me was creating the firm, something to be proud of, something sustainable, something I could look back on and say, yes, I did that. The company underwent a transformation over the years. We began offering new services, created some unique technological solutions, and moved into markets we never imagined possible. Revenue progressively increased, from scraping by to reaching 8 figures, and then crossing into 9. It was weird to see something that was on the verge of collapse transform into an industry leader. I should have felt great, but there was always this underlying tension. Brian wasn't as absent anymore. As the company grew in success, he began to appear more frequently at the workplace, acting as if he were an essential part of the operation. Everyone knew better, but no one said anything, including Dad. Looking back, I believe that was the first hint that something was wrong. Brian disliked the fact that the spotlight was no longer totally focused on him. He'd joke about how I was too serious or needed a life outside of the job, but there was an edge to his remarks, as if he was preparing for something. I had no idea what it was, but I could feel it. Still, I kept my head down and concentrated on my work. I wasn't going to let his anxieties destroy all I'd worked so hard for, or so I told myself. In actuality, I didn't believe he could cause much damage. I underestimated him. That was my first error. By the time we reached $150 million in revenue, the fractures were beginning to appear. I just hadn't realized how deep they were. I knew something was wrong the moment Dad called the shareholder meeting. It's not like he hadn't gathered us before, but this time felt different. The phrase he used, a significant announcement about the company's future, had a finality to it. I assumed it was about his retirement. After all, he had been talking about taking a step back for years, particularly after the company had steadied. I was not nervous. If anything, I was prepared. I'd been running the company, without a title, for years, and this meeting seemed like a formality to make it official. I wasn't seeking for a pat on the back, but I assumed this was a logical step. Who else might take over? Brian arrived late, of course. That was vintage Brian. I was already at the boardroom table, reviewing my notes for the presentation I'd prepared, when he walked in, as if nothing mattered. He was always smiling, shaking hands, and cracking jokes. Everyone adored him. That's the issue with Brian. You almost forgot he'd never done anything to deserve the respect he received. He had a knack of making people feel like he belonged, even if he didn't. He threw me a wink as he sat down, which made my stomach turn. Not because I was afraid. Brian had never posed a genuine threat, but because it appeared premeditated. I brushed it off. It makes no sense to let my thoughts go wild before the conference even begins. Dad entered a few minutes later, looking exhausted but resolute. He began his normal spiel about the company's history, how important it was to him, and how proud he was of what we had accomplished. It was a little over the top, but that was Dad's style. He loved to set the tone before breaking the big news. When he finally came to the point, he stood up, fixed his glasses, and said, "It's time for me to pass the torch." He hesitated, gazing around the room, as if expecting for applause or something. After much consideration, I've decided that Brian will be the new CEO. I swear, time paused for a second. My brain refused to process what I had just heard. Is Brian the CEO? Surely this was a mistake. I looked at Brian, and he was beaming from ear to ear. Not surprised, not taken off guard, just grinning. That's when it struck me. He had known. He had known all along. I didn't have time to think about it because Dad continued, going, "I believe Brian embodies the leadership qualities this company needs to move forward." He told me leadership qualities? The guy who was often late for meetings? The individual whose only contribution to the organization was depleting the entertainment fund for years? Before I could say anything, Brian stood up, clutching a folder. "I'd like to take a moment to address something important," he continued, his tone formal, which was amusing, coming from him. He opened the folder and began flicking through the pages, making a huge show out of it. "Over the past few months," he continued, "I've come across some troubling discrepancies in the way certain decisions have been made." He looked at me and then at the board members, as if he was trying to judge their reactions. "It appears that my brother has been operating outside his authority." I couldn't believe what I heard. He went on to accuse me of conducting unapproved deals, exceeding my authority, and compromising the company's name. He portrayed me as a reckless, power-hungry character who had run amok while Dad was distracted. It was all very cleverly worded, just vague enough to sound reasonable, without providing any actual evidence. I opened my lips to defend myself, but Dad interrupted me. "Let him finish," he responded, his tone calm but forceful. Brian concluded his brief presentation by saying, "I only bring this up because I care deeply about the company's future, and I want to ensure we maintain the highest level of integrity." Integrity, coming from Brian. The irony was almost too much to bear. When he was finished, the room fell silent. All eyes were on Dad, who took a big breath and announced, "After reviewing the situation, I've decided to terminate Kevin's employment, effective immediately." And my world came crumbling down. Security guards emerged out of nowhere, standing by the entrance, seemingly waiting for the signal to haul me out. I did not fight it. I did not even say anything. What was there to say? The decision had been decided long before the meeting, and I had fallen right into their trap. As I was gathering my belongings, Brian leaned over and muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Nothing personal, little brother, just business." That was when I realized it wasn't all about the corporation. This was about him demonstrating something. To me, Dad, and anybody who had ever compared us. He wasn't concerned about the company's future. He was concerned about taking it from me. I walked out of that boardroom with all the decorum I could summon, but inside, I was seething. Not only was I caught off guard, but Brian had used years of hard effort against me. He had not only taken the job, but also the narrative. By the time I arrived to my car, my phone was already flooded with texts from coworkers, friends, and even a few board members who were taken aback by what had occurred. I disregarded them all. I needed to think. The drive home was a haze. I continued repeating the encounter in my thoughts, trying to figure out why I had missed the signs. Looking back, they were all there. Brian showing up at the workplace more frequently, Dad being abnormally secretive, and even some of the board members behaving distant recently. I'd been so preoccupied with operating the company that I hadn't noticed the storm developing right under my nose. When I arrived home, I sat in the dark for hours, trying to make sense of everything. How could Dad, the guy who had seen me devote my life to this enterprise, choose Brian? Was it loyalty, blind favoritism, or was I just so replaceable in his eyes? Whatever the cause, one thing was certain, I was out, and Brian was in. But here's the thing about Brian. He's terrific at portraying the character, but he's lousy at recognizing the stakes. While he was busy celebrating his victory, he didn't realize I wasn't leaving empty-handed. Far from it. I had spent years establishing more than simply a business. I had created leverage, and while they were busy scheming my ruin, they didn't bother to investigate how deep my roots were. That night, I reached a choice. I was not going to fight Brian directly. That's what he expected and wanted, a chance to portray me as bitter and spiteful. No, I planned to do something much smarter. I was going to wait, and when the time came, I was going to remind them all of who started this empire in the first place. The first thing I did was contact a few important employees who had been with the company through thick and thin. These were not spectacular, high-profile individuals. Rather, they served as the company's backbone, the IT staff, a few senior developers, and 2 managers who had worked with me during those difficult early years. I knew they'd answer my phone because, unlike Brian, I'd taken the effort to establish relationships. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't have to. All I said was that there was a lot going on behind the scenes, and if they trusted me, they should wait a few days before making any major choices. Nobody asked questions or hesitated. That was all I needed to know about their loyalty. Next, I focused on the infrastructure. The advantage of rebuilding a company from the ground up is that you know where every piece fits. Over time, I surreptitiously established a separate business to manage our most precious assets, including intellectual property, customer contracts, and proprietary software. On paper, it was simply a support firm, designed to streamline operations. In truth, it was the center of the business, and I owned it entirely. Why hadn't I informed anyone about it? Because I knew something like this was going to happen eventually, maybe not exactly this, but I had a feeling Brian would try to play some form of power play. What about Dad? Let's just say I gave up expecting him to have my back a long time ago. With everything in place, I spent the remainder of the weekend getting receipts, metaphorically speaking. I sifted through years of documents, emails, contracts, and bank records, gathering evidence of Brian's neglect, mismanagement, and blatant dodgy activity. Some of it was minor issues, such as excessive expenditure and missed deadlines. Other issues were more serious, side dealings with competitors, questionable transactions, and moves that jeopardized the company's future. By Sunday night, I had a folder thick enough to stop a bullet, but that wasn't the endgame. My intention was not to completely ruin Brian. That would have been too simple, and it would have accomplished nothing. My goal was to remind everyone, Brian, Dad, and the board, why I was the one who had originally turned the firm around. On Monday morning, I awoke earlier than usual, not because I had anywhere to go, but because I wanted to witness the aftermath in real time. I brewed coffee, set up my laptop in my home office, and connected to the company's internal network. Yes, I still had access. You'd think a guy like Brian, with all his leadership abilities, Would have thought to withdraw my credentials right away, but no. The first thing I did was activate the failsafe I had programmed into the system years ago. There were no viruses or other dangerous software involved. It was merely a small script that transferred all internal communications to a secure server under my control. Emails, memos, meeting invitations, it all went through me. Then, I focused my attention on Brian's PC. Again, no hacking was necessary. He hadn't even changed his password. It was the same one he'd used since college. I uploaded a video file to his desktop and set it to play automatically when he checked in. What about the video? A highlight reel of his worst decisions, replete with timestamps and accompanying documentation. It wasn't spectacular or too dramatic. It was simply a cold, stark reminder of his inadequacy. By 8:15 a.m., the commotion had started. Brian walked into the office, looking smug as ever, and I observed him through the security feed. He sat down at the CEO's desk, turned on his computer, and leaned back in his chair as if he owned the place. A second later, the video began playing. At first, he appeared bewildered. Then his face flushed red. He banged the keyboard a few times in an attempt to close the file, but it remained open. Every screen in his office showed the same film, in repeat. Meanwhile, the notifications began. Board members, department heads, and major investors' inboxes began to fill up, one by one, with emails. Each email comprised a piece of evidence I had gathered, along with a brief description of how Brian's actions had harmed the organization. I kept the tone professional, no accusations, just facts. Down in the lobby, federal agents entered. I had informed the authorities about some of Brian's more questionable financial practices, and they were ready to speak with him. What about the cherry on top? An email from the IT department, notifying the resignation. They had all signed contracts with my subsidiary and were no longer employed by the corporation. The email concluded with a simple statement. We stand with the person who built this company. I saw Brian try to hold it together. He phoned IT support, but no one answered. He called Dad, but his phone went directly to voicemail. He even tried calling me at one point, but I didn't answer. By mid-morning, the board had called an emergency meeting. Brian was summoned, and from what I saw on the security stream, it was not a friendly conversation. I didn't need to hear what was said in that room to know how things ended. By noon, Brian had been led out of the building. I didn't feel smug or vindicated as I watched the events unfold. If anything, I felt relaxed. This was not about vengeance. It was about balance. Brian had spent years relying on charm and manipulation, but when it came down to it, he couldn't keep it up. What about Dad? Well, he had made his decision. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. The game had changed, and for the first time in a long time, I had complete control of the situation. The news quickly spread. Employees were muttering by the afternoon about federal authorities arriving, Brian leaving, and the CEO being hauled out of the premises. In the age of immediate communication, this type of turmoil cannot be restrained. By the next morning, rumors had turned into headlines. Company scandal rocks leadership team. There were no names yet, but everyone understood who they were talking about. The stock price plummeted. It wasn't a steady drop, it was a free fall. Investors began withdrawing as soon as they discovered the company's fundamental assets were no longer in its hands. That was intentional, of course. The subsidiary I'd established to house it all had been legally autonomous for years, and it was now the foundation of my new business. Brian inherited a bright, empty shell. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. I wasn't about to show up in the middle of this and look like the man who rubbed salt in the wound. I'd already done enough to disrupt Brian's alleged authority. The following step was not about myself, but about the individuals who truly made the company operate. That morning, I wrote an email to every employee. It was short and to the point. Subject, a new opportunity. To the present staff, you have witnessed the happenings of the previous day. Many of you are probably concerned about your future. I want you to know that your efforts and dedication have not gone unappreciated. I'm inviting you to join a new organization where your contributions will be respected, your jobs will be secure, and you'll be working with leaders that value innovation and honesty. Your jobs and benefits will remain unchanged, with more support and possibilities for advancement. If you're interested, you may learn more here. Link. There is no pressure. This is totally your decision. Thank you for what you have done. You deserve better, and I hope I can deliver it. Kevin. By the end of the day, my inbox was swamped with responses. People weren't simply signing on. They were thanking me for giving them an out. It was surreal to hear notes from people who had persevered with the company through its worst days, telling me they believed in me, not the organization that had just collapsed. Over 93% of the employees accepted the offer within hours. Brian, on the other hand, was not doing so well. By midweek, the probe into his financial actions had become public. That's when the true dirt came out. It was discovered that he had been siphoning money via forged vendor contracts. He'd also been collaborating with competitors, selling client information in exchange for under-the-table money. I was aware of some of it, but seeing it all laid out in black and white was overwhelming. The officials acted promptly. Brian was legally charged with fraud, embezzlement, and a variety of other charges. He was released on bail, but his reputation was ruined. The media had a field day, portraying him as the poster child for nepotism gone bad. Every element of his antics, the parties, the reckless spending, and the backroom deals was brought to light. And then there was Dad. He went radio silent for the first few days, most likely trying to digest what had just transpired. I can only imagine how he felt when he realized that the son he had trusted and favored for decades had turned out to be a massive liability. The board was not spared either. The investors who remained sought answers, and the remaining members scrambled to minimize the damage. But what could they say? The company's basis had been pulled out from underneath them. Everything that made the business valuable was now integrated into my new operation. That week, I met with the leadership team of my new employer. These were the individuals who had followed me out of the chaos: the IT director, the head of operations, a few important managers, and the core development team. We sat around a conference table in the new office space I had secretly reserved months before. It wasn't spectacular, just an efficient, modern setup with plenty of room to expand. The first order of business, I continued, is to ensure that everyone feels stable here. No shocks or gimmicks. We've all gone through enough of that. Everyone nodded around the table. I could see relief on their expressions. For years, they had been caught in the crossfire of poor judgment and partiality. They could now focus on their task without worrying about what Brian would do next. The change was not without its challenges. As expected, there were legal challenges, and a few clients required additional reassurance that this was the appropriate decision. But altogether, things went more smoothly than I had expected. By the end of the month, we were completely operational, and I could finally breathe a bit easier. Meanwhile, the original corporation continued its decline. With no assets, no leadership, and no clear path forward, it became a cautionary tale in the corporate world. The stock price, which had been artificially inflated by years of hype, was now worth pennies. Investors left, litigation piled up, and the remaining staff struggled to find new positions. Brian, obviously, attempted to spin the story in his favor. He spoke to a local newspaper, stating he had been set up and that the probe was politically motivated. It did not land. By that point, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and even his father refused to defend him publicly. In this scenario, justice was not about destroying Brian, but about holding him accountable. For far too long, he had left it to others to clean up his messes. This time, there was no one left to save him. When the dust settled, the message was clear. Leadership isn't about titles or favoritism. It's about doing the work, winning trust, and accepting responsibility. Brian had failed at all three, and he was now reaping the consequences. I wasn't out for retribution or gloating. I was determined to create something new, free of the faults of the past. The aftermath had been chaotic, but it was also vital. Sometimes, the only way to mend something damaged is to dismantle it and start afresh. A week after Brian's public humiliation, I received the call I was expecting. It wasn't from Brian, but from Dad. He'd been keeping his distance ever since things went wrong, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he reached out. He left a short and direct message on my phone. "We need to talk. Your mother and I are going to see you tomorrow." I did not respond. What was there to say? I understood exactly why he was calling. It wasn't an apology, and it certainly wasn't an admission that he had made a mistake. No, this was about the fallout, the tanking stock price, the litigation, the investors bailing out, and the fact that his entire retirement fund was now invested in a company that was on the verge of failure. The next morning, Dad and Mom arrived at my new company's office on time. I had purposefully kept the place low-key, but I was not trying to hide. They discovered me easy enough. When they walked in, I realized how much they had aged in such a short period of time. Dad looked like he hadn't slept in days, and Mom appeared to have been sobbing a lot. They both sat across from me in the small conference room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Dad was the first to speak. "Kevin," he said, his voice straining. "You've made your point, but we need to figure out how to fix this." I sat back in my chair and crossed my arms. "What exactly do you want fixed?" I asked. "The mess Brian made, the company you allowed him to destroy, or the reality that your retirement savings are worthless?" Mom flinched, and Dad's expression stiffened. "This isn't the time for blame," he added, trying to remain calm. "We are family. We need to get together and figure this out." I nearly laughed. Now he wants to discuss family? After years of allowing Brian to walk all over me, after firing me in the most humiliating manner possible, now he was interested in unity? "You don't get to play the family card now, Dad," I responded calmly. "You made it pretty clear where your loyalty lies." He sighed deeply and ran a hand over his face. "I didn't know what Brian was doing. He told me, didn't you?" I shot back. "You may not have known the specifics, but you knew he was unqualified. You knew he was overspending. You knew he didn't show up half the time, and you let him take control anyhow." Mom began to speak, but I held up a hand to silence her. "Don't," I replied, shaking my head. "You're not allowed to defend him either. You both made the bed. Now you want me to clean up?" There was a prolonged hush. "Finally," Dad stated, "your mother and I are in a difficult situation. Everything we have saved is related to their firm. If we don't work something out, we may lose the house." And there it was, the real reason for their visit. It was not about Brian or the company. It was about money. I took a deep breath and leaned forward on the table. "I'm going to help you," I said. Relief flooded across their cheeks, but I wasn't finished. "This is how it's going to work," I explained. "I will acquire your company shares at their original value. That will allow you to keep your home and retire comfortably. However, there are some conditions." Dad frowned. "What type of conditions?" "First," I said, "you both sign a non-disclosure agreement. That means no telling anyone, friends, relatives, or reporters, what happened to Brian or the company. Second, you retire peacefully. No more tinkering or attempting to mend things. Third, the money is not free of conditions. You will receive a monthly allowance, and any big expense must be approved by a trustee." Mom seemed to want to object, but Dad grabbed her arm. "That seems extreme," he responded cautiously. "Extreme?" I repeated, reclining back in my seat. "Dad, I'm being generous. I do not owe you anything. After everything that had happened, I could have gone away and left you to deal with the mess you created, but I am not doing this for you. I'm doing it because, deep down, I still care about this family, even though you don't deserve it." That final line impacted more than I expected. I thought Dad was going to protest, but he just nodded slowly. "Fine," he said. "We'll sign whatever you need us to sign." Mom glanced at him with wide eyes. "Leonard, it's the best we're going to get," he interrupted her. I stood up, signaling that the meeting had ended. "I'll have the paperwork ready before tomorrow. Once you sign, the cash will be transferred within 48 hours. They also stood, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. This was the man who had always urged me to accept responsibility, admit my faults, and strive for improvement. And here he was, crushed and defeated, pleading for a bailout from the son he'd neglected for years. As they went, Dad looked back and said, "You're a better man than I gave you credit for." I did not respond. Words no longer meant much to me, especially when they came from him. When the door closed behind them, I sat back down and stared at the table for quite some time. This was hardly the victory I had expected. It did not feel like a victory at all, but it was required. Sometimes, doing the right thing does not feel pleasant. It simply feels like a satisfactory conclusion. I didn't feel relieved or satisfied the day my parents signed the papers. Instead, I felt a peculiar sense of emptiness. It was finished. They had accepted the terms, and the money was on its way to them. I knew that was the correct thing to do, but it didn't seem like a victory. If anything, it seemed like I was finally bringing an end to something that had been broken for years. But life does not allow for introspection. While my parents adjusted to their new financial reality, I had a firm to run, one that, for the first time, was fully mine. The transfer from the old company to my new venture went more smoothly than I had anticipated. Most of the personnel came over willingly, and the important clients stayed with us. It wasn't only about loyalty. They recognized the value of the relationships and mechanisms we'd established. If anything, the tumult surrounding Brian's demise had strengthened their faith in me. They realized who the true driving force behind the organization had been all along. One of the most significant adjustments I implemented was how we worked as a corporation. I had learned a lot from my blunders in the past, particularly regarding honesty and communication. Under the previous regime, decisions were frequently taken behind closed doors, leaving people rushing to adjust without a clear explanation. I wanted to do things differently. We began holding weekly all-hands meetings where I lay out everything: progress, challenges, and impending goals. No fluff, no business jargon, just plain talk about where we were and where we were going. The first few meetings were slightly awkward. People were unaccustomed to that kind of candor, and I could see some of them were waiting for the other shoe to drop. But over time, they began to relax. They began to trust me when I claimed we were in this together. One of the most pleasant moments occurred around a month in, when one of the senior developers approached me after a meeting. He'd been with the company for years, one of the silent workhorses who got the job done without making a fuss. "Kevin," he began, "I just wanted to thank you. I've been here a long time, and this is the first time I felt that someone is truly concerned about what we're doing." It took me off guard. I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded and said, "That means a lot. Thank you for staying with us." Those brief moments reminded me why I was doing this. It was not about proving something to Brian, Dad, or anyone else. It was about creating something meaningful, something people would be happy to be a part of. By the conclusion of the first quarter, we had achieved not just stability, but also growth. Revenue was increasing, client retention was at an all-time high, and we had even begun bringing in new business. The team was electrified, and the workplace was alive with a level of excitement I hadn't seen in years. One day, as I walked through the workplace, I overheard two employees conversing by the coffee machine. They didn't notice me, so I didn't interrupt. Honestly, one of them admitted, "This is the finest thing that could have occurred. The previous company was a complete mess. I feel like we have a future here." The other person nodded. "Yes, Kevin gets it. He is not just sitting in his office, barking instructions. He is genuinely developing something with us." Hearing that was more satisfying than receiving any award or accolade. It wasn't simply the numbers or the growth that mattered. It was the fact that people believed in our mission. Meanwhile, the old corporation was just scraping by. The lawsuits were stacking up, the stock was basically worthless, and the remaining employees were leaving as quickly as they could. Brian, from what I heard, was attempting to avoid the spotlight, but the harm to his reputation had already been done. He was no longer a name people wanted to associate with. By 6 months, the new company had established itself as the industry leader. We were not only surviving, we were innovating. We developed a new product line that improved logistics for small firms, and it grew faster than we expected. It felt like everything I'd been working on for the previous 10 years was finally coming together. For years, I'd fought to prove myself to Dad, Brian, and everybody else who had ever doubted me. But in that moment, I knew I didn't have to prove anything anymore. I had created something real, something that would last, and for the first time in a long time, I felt calm. It's been 3 years since everything went down. If I'm being honest, I still think about it now and then. Not in a bad way, but in a way that makes me wonder how I survived it all. Despite the fact that it drastically altered my life, the entire incident feels like a distant memory. My new company is booming. When I say thriving, I mean we've achieved every goal I ever imagined. The team we formed after leaving the previous organization has evolved into something I am very proud of. We are not only lucrative, but also respected. People in the industry regard us as the gold standard, the type of organization that others strive to replicate. That feels good, not because of the recognition, but because it confirms that we are doing things correctly. But let us be honest, prosperity does not erase the past. Every now and then, I find myself going through old emails or looking at news headlines about the consequences. Brian's name crops up on occasion, usually as part of a cautionary tale about leadership or nepotism. Last I heard, he was working at a low-level job to avoid detection. I don't maintain tabs on him, but it's difficult not to hear things when your name and his are still vaguely related in some circles. My folks have settled into a tranquil retirement. Mom occasionally sends me emails with updates on their new activities or the neighborhood potlucks they have started hosting. Dad, however, has been mute. I haven't communicated with him since the day he signed the papers in my office. I don't think he's bitter, but I also don't think he understands how to rebuild the bridge he burnt. And frankly, I'm not sure I'd let him try. It's funny how much perspective time provides you. When everything first started, I was so intent on proving myself, showing everyone that I was the one who deserved to lead. But 3 years later, I realize I don't care about it anymore. People who know and work with me already understand the type of person I am. I don't need to shout my triumphs from the rooftops, and I certainly don't need confirmation from those who question me. For those who are wondering how the quiet one came out on top, let me explain. While others were busy posturing and playing politics, I was doing the work. While they were making noise, I was planning. Because at the end of the day, being the loudest or flashiest is not what defines success. It's about strategy, resilience, and recognizing what you're capable of, even when no one else does. The peacocks may attract attention, but what about the eagles? We are the ones who observe things from above. And that's the end of the story, or the beginning, depending on your perspective. Thank you for sticking around. Please let me know if you have any questions, thoughts, or tales to offer. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.